All right, picture this. It's September 2008. The entire global financial system is, and I'm not exaggerating here, just 72 hours away from a complete and total meltdown. And right then in Washington, a man walks into Congress with a tiny 3-page document. His request? $700 billion. With no conditions, no oversight, basically a blank check. This is the story of that bailout, TARP, and how it literally built the financial world we're all still living in today.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll go right to the brink of chaos. Then, we'll look at how Wall Street built this insane house of cards in the first place. We're going to uncover the bailout's big twist, the one that nobody ever seems to talk about. Then, we'll get into the really uncomfortable math of the aftermath. And finally, we'll explore the world that TARP built, which, well, it's the one we're in right now.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It is September 2008. And the feeling behind the closed doors of power, the word on the street is just pure terror. The system isn't just shaking a little, it's about to completely fall apart.
And look, this wasn't some abstract economic theory that might play out over a few months. No, the timeline here was terrifyingly short. We are talking about a situation where, within 3 days, the entire global financial system was expected to just stop. The whole engine of the world's economy was about to seize up.
So what does a collapse like that actually mean for you and me? Well, it means you go to an ATM and it's dark. Nothing comes out. It means your company literally can't get the cash to pay you, so your paycheck bounces. It means your retirement account, your life savings, all of it could just poof, vanish. That was the reality they were staring down.
So, into this absolute chaos walks the Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson. And he hands Congress this ridiculously short 3-page plan. The ask? A mind-boggling $700 billion. And the craziest part? He wanted it with zero strings attached. Just a blank check to go save the very banks that lit the fire in the first place.
But how on earth did we get to this point? I mean, to really get why the whole system was about to implode, you have to understand the absurdly fragile structure Wall Street had built. It was a masterpiece of complexity and, as it turned out, just unbelievable risk.
You know, this Jenga tower metaphor is pretty much perfect. Imagine every financial product out there. Mortgages, car loans, pension funds. Each one is a block in this giant tower. But they're all connected by these invisible strings. The entire thing, this whole global structure, was built on one single, deeply flawed belief that U.S. housing prices across the whole country would never, ever go down.
And this is how they pulled it off. It was like a garbage into gold machine. Step 1, banks handed out terrible mortgages to people they knew couldn't possibly pay them back. Step 2, they took thousands of these bad loans, threw them into a kind of mathematical blender, and mixed them all up. Step 3, somehow out the other side came what looked like a solid gold brick, and they stamped it with a AAA safety rating, the highest you can get. And then they sold these supposedly super safe investments to pension funds and retirees all over the world. And then the impossible happened. In 2006, housing prices actually started to fall. The Jenga tower started to wobble. By March of 2008, a huge investment bank, Bear Stearns, completely collapsed. And then came the big one. In September, the government made a decision that changed everything. They let Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old company, go bankrupt. The market reacted with just pure animal terror, and the entire system froze solid.
So that brings us to the bailout itself. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP. But here's the thing. The story you were told about how this money was going to be used, yeah, that's not what actually happened. There was a critical, let's call it a pivot.
Now, at first, Congress actually said no. They rejected Paulson's plan. And the market's reaction was, well, it was an absolute meltdown. The Dow Jones dropped 777 points. At the time, it was the largest single-day point drop in history. The panic was so real, so intense, that it forced Congress right back to the table 3 days later. And this time, the bailout passed.
But this is where the plan did a complete 180. The pitch, the official story, was that the government was going to buy up all those toxic mortgage assets, the garbage, to get them off the bank's books. But in reality, that turned out to be way too complicated to do quickly. So instead, they just changed the plan. They decided to inject capital directly into the banks by buying their stock. In other words, they just gave them cash.
And here is where the story gets truly bizarre. To avoid the stigma of only bailing out the banks that were totally failing,
The government actually forced healthy banks to take the money too. Think about that. Banks like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, who insisted they didn't even need it, were basically strong-armed into taking taxpayer money just so the really sick banks wouldn't look so bad. It was like giving everyone a participation trophy for nearly crashing the world.
And the scale of this was just staggering. The Treasury pumped $245 billion directly into more than 700 banks. Of course, the biggest players got the biggest checks. $45 billion for Citigroup, another $45 billion for Bank of America, and $40 billion for the insurance giant AIG, which was just a black hole for taxpayer money.
So, okay, let's talk about the consequences. The bailout worked, right? I mean, the system didn't totally collapse, but what it did was create this incredibly dangerous new precedent, this really uncomfortable moral equation that, honestly, we are still wrestling with today.
The key idea here is something called moral hazard. It's pretty simple. If you protect an institution from the consequences of its own terrible decisions, you're not just forgiving them. You are actively encouraging them to do it again, but even bigger next time. TARP basically institutionalized moral hazard on a global scale. The message to Wall Street was loud and clear. If you are big enough, don't worry, we will always save you.
And this created a just stunning disconnect from reality. In 2009, while millions of Americans were losing their homes and unemployment was skyrocketing, Wall Street paid itself $20 billion, not in salaries, in bonuses. It was like the people who built the meteor were getting rewarded for surviving the impact.
So what about accountability? Well, the number of high-level bank executives who went to jail for their role in the crisis was exactly 0. The banks, sure, they paid billions in fines. But for an institution that makes tens of billions in profit, a fine isn't a punishment. It's just the cost of doing business.
What this whole episode did was create a brand new rule for our economy: socialized losses and privatized gains. It's like a casino, where the banks get to keep all their winnings, but whenever they have a huge losing streak, the taxpayers are forced to come in and cover all their debts. It's capitalism on the way up and socialism on the way down, but only for a very, very select few.
And that brings us to the world we live in right now. You see, the decisions made in the panic of 2008 didn't just fix a problem. They fundamentally reshaped our entire financial system. And you could argue they made it even more dangerous.
The whole point of the bailout was supposedly to solve the too-big-to-fail problem. Instead, it made it way worse. Before the crisis, the 5 biggest banks in the U.S. held about 35% of all banking assets. By 2023, that number had ballooned to 45%. The biggest banks just got even bigger, which means the risk is even more concentrated.
And the TARP playbook? It's now the default response. The precedent is set in stone. You see, regulations rolled back in 2018. Then in 2023, when Silicon Valley Bank fails, the government jumps in within 48 hours to guarantee all deposits, even ones way above the insured limit. When First Republic Bank fails a few months later, another rescue is put together. The question is no longer if the government will intervene, it's just a matter of how fast.
So in the end, TARP wasn't a solution. It was a painkiller, a very, very expensive painkiller. It stopped the immediate bleeding and it stabilized the patient, but it did absolutely nothing to cure the underlying disease. We spent $700 billion to buy ourselves some time, and the real question is, what did we actually do with that time?
And that leaves us right here, with the central dilemma of our modern financial system. It's the one question that TARP forced us all to ask, but never actually answered. If a bank or any company becomes so big and so interconnected that we can't let it fail without risking a global catastrophe, then maybe the problem isn't the failure. Maybe the problem is its very existence. It's a question we still haven't figured out, and it's one that hangs over our economy to this very day.